The dust tasted of shame. It coated her tongue, settled in the folds of her ragged dress, and clung to her skin like a shroud woven from grit and indifference. She did not remember a time before the dust. It was the grit under her fingernails, the haze that blurred the horizon, the constant companion to the sun's unblinking eye. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square. The rope was coarse, biting into the raw skin of her wrists. It was a familiar pain, a dull anchor in the shifting sea of humiliation. She kept her gaze fixed on a loose board in the raised platform of the general store porch, counting the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from the largest knot, like a frozen map of a place she would never go. A man stood on that porch. His name was Sterling, and his voice was as slick and polished as the handle of the cane he leaned upon. He wasn't selling a horse or a parcel of land. He was selling her. "A bit worn," Sterling announced, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the assembled crowd. "But serviceable. Good for mending, cleaning. Quiet too. Hasn't spoken a word in a month. A blessing for any man tired of a woman's chatter." A few men chuckled, a dry, cracking sound like stones rolling downhill. The women in the crowd looked away, their faces pulled into masks of pity or contempt. They were one and the same to the girl tied to the post. She just kept her eyes on the wood, counting the cracks. She had been passed along before, from a failed farm to a desperate miner, then to Sterling as payment for a debt. Each time, she was an object, a sack of grain to be weighed and bartered. Each time, a piece of her had flaked away, turning to dust and blowing off with the prairie wind. What was left was a hollow thing, thin as a fence rail, with eyes that had seen too much to bother looking anymore. "She comes with nothing," Sterling continued, gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "But she asks for nothing in return. A roof, a bit of bread. She will not trouble you." He was making her sound like a stray dog. Maybe she was. The sun beat down, turning the air thick and heavy. The crowd grew restless, shifting their weight. No one stepped forward. No one made an offer. She was damaged goods, a ghost already, and no one wanted a haunt in their home. A fly buzzed near her ear, persistent and irritating. She didn't have a free hand to wave it away. From the edge of the small gathering, leaning against the shadowed wall of the smithy, a man watched. His name was Elias, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. He had not come to town for this. He had come for salt and nails, the necessary things that held a life together. He had intended to be gone before the sun was high, back to the silence of his homestead, where the only company was the wind and the ghost of his wife, Sarah. He watched the girl. He saw the way her shoulders were hunched, not in fear, but in a kind of permanent resignation. He saw the raw marks on her wrists, the cracked, bare feet caked with the same dust that covered everything. He saw the utter emptiness in her posture, a body that had given up on its own spirit. He saw the crowd's casual cruelty, Sterling's preening pride. It was a rot he knew well, the kind that festered in lonely places. Sterling was growing impatient. His performance was falling flat. "Fine," he spat, his voice losing its polished edge. "Take her for the debt I was owed. $10. A bargain for a strong back." Silence. The fly buzzed. The sun baked the ground. Elias pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were pushing against a great weight. He didn't walk to the front. He simply stood where he was, a tall, weathered shape in the shade. The dust on his coat and hat made him look like a part of the landscape, something that had grown out of the hard earth itself. He raised a hand, just a slight lift of his fingers. Sterling squinted, his eyes unaccustomed to the shade. "What's that, Elias? You making a bid?" Elias's voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, low and unused. "5." A ripple went through the crowd. Not 10, but 5. It wasn't an offer of value. It was an insult. Sterling's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "5? Are you mocking me?" The rope is worth more than 5 inch. Elias didn't move. His gaze was steady, fixed not on Sterling, but on the girl. He saw her flinch at his voice, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders. $5, Elias repeated. His hand went into his worn coat and came out with a small leather pouch. He tossed it onto the dusty ground between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a closing door. Sterling stared at the pouch, then at Elias's unyielding face. He saw no profit here, only the quiet, stubborn will of a man who had nothing left to lose. Pride warred with greed. Greed won, as it often did. He stooped, snatched the pouch and stuffed it into his pocket. "She's yours, then?" Sterling sneered. "Don't come crying to me when you find out what a hollow bargain you've struck." The crowd began to disperse, the spectacle over. They had their gossip for the week. Elias, the grieving recluse, had bought himself a woman. They murmured as they walked away, their words like the scraping of dry leaves. Elias waited until the square was nearly empty. He walked past the jeering ghost of Sterling, who had retreated to his porch. He stopped in front of the girl, who still had not looked up from the knotted wood. He smelled of pine and earth and solitude. He reached into his pocket and took out a small, sharp knife. He didn't touch her. He simply reached forward and, with 2 swift, clean cuts, severed the ropes. They fell away from her wrists, leaving angry red welts behind. He stepped back, giving her space. He said nothing. He just waited. For a long moment, she remained frozen, her hands still in the air as if the ropes were still there. Then, slowly, she lowered them. She flexed her fingers once, twice. She looked at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Finally, she lifted her head. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, met his for the first time. They held no gratitude, no fear, only a vast and silent question. Elias gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward his wagon, parked at the far end of the street. Then he turned and walked away, not looking back to see if she followed. He knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. The journey to his homestead was made in a silence as wide and empty as the plains around them. The wagon wheels cut twin lines in the dust, tracks that seemed to stretch into eternity. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts trying to keep pace. She sat on the rough wooden bench beside him, a still, small shape, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He did not try to speak to her. The air was too full of things unsaid, of histories too heavy to be lifted with mere words. He drove the horses at a steady, unhurried pace, his eyes on the horizon. The landscape was his language, a vocabulary of cracked earth, sparse, hardy brush, and a sky that was too big, too blue, too indifferent. Halfway there, where a lone, skeletal cottonwood offered a sliver of shade, he stopped the team. Without a word, he took up a canteen from the floor of the wagon. He uncorked it, drank, then held it out to her. She stared at the canteen for a long moment, as if it were a test. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and peeling. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and her hand was cold, despite the searing heat. She drank, long and deep, the water a shock of life in her desolate interior. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and passed it back to him. Their eyes met again, for just a second. A transaction, not of money, but of water. A shared, fundamental need. They reached his claim as dusk was beginning to bleed blood orange and purple along the western edge of the world. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. It was a structure born of necessity, not comfort. It stood alone against the vast emptiness, braced against the wind. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign he had banked the fire before he left. Beside the cabin, under a gnarled oak, was a small, fenced-in plot of land. A single wooden cross stood at its head, weathered to a soft silver gray. Sarah. The name was unspoken, but it hung in the air, in the careful tending of the plot, in the very stillness of the house. He brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He began to unhitch the horses, his movements economical and practiced. He did not tell her what to do. He simply went about his work, leaving her to find her own place in this new silence. She slid down from the wagon seat, her bare feet sinking into the cool, soft dirt of the yard. The dust here was different from the town's dust. It smelled of earth and growing things, of life clinging stubbornly to existence. The house was quiet. It did not feel empty, but waiting. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. When he was done with the horses, he walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. It swung inward on leather hinges, revealing a single room, clean but stark. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner, a pallet of straw and blankets in another. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He walked to the hearth, stirred the embers and added a few small logs. A flame caught, weak at first, then stronger, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows made the room seem both smaller and larger at once. He gestured to the straw pallet. "That's yours," he said, his first direct instruction. Then he turned to the table, where a loaf of dark bread and a round of cheese sat under a piece of cloth. He cut a thick slice of each with his knife and placed them on a wooden plate. He set the plate on the table on the side closer to her. He did not invite her to eat. He simply provided the food. He filled a dipper with water from a bucket by the door and set it beside the plate. Then he took his own portion and sat in the chair opposite, his back to the fire. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze fixed on the firelight playing on the floorboards. This was the contract she understood. Unspoken, unwritten, but clear as the lines on his weathered face. Food, shelter, a place to sleep where the door was not locked. He asked for nothing, and in return, he expected her to be as quiet and unobtrusive as the shadows. She could do that. Silence was the only thing she truly owned. She walked to the table, sat down, and began to eat. The bread was coarse, but it was real. It was enough. The days settled into a rhythm, as steady and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. They were 2 silent planets orbiting the small star of the cabin's hearth. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet in the gray light, and head out to the fields. He was mending fences, turning soil, fighting the constant, losing battle against the encroaching wilderness. She would wake to the sound of his departure, the soft thud of the door closing behind him. In the stillness he left behind, the cabin felt like hers. She learned its secrets, the floorboard that creaked by the hearth, the way the morning sun slanted through the single window, illuminating a galaxy of dust motes, the scent of Sarah that still clung to a small, carved box on the mantelpiece, a ghost of lavender and cedar. She began to work, not because he told her to, but because idleness was a weight she could not bear. She swept the floor until the packed earth was smooth and cool under her bare feet. She scrubbed the table with sand and water until the wood grain showed, pale and clean. She washed his few shirts in the creek and hung them on a line strung between the cabin and the oak tree. They flapped in the wind, white flags of truce in a silent war. He never acknowledged her work with words, but he would come in from the fields, his face etched with exhaustion, and his eyes would scan the room. He would notice the neatly stacked firewood, the clean plate waiting for him, the small bundle of wildflowers she'd placed in a tin cup on the windowsill. His gaze would linger for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before he would sit and eat in his customary silence. One afternoon, while weeding the small vegetable patch near the grave, her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth in the dirt. She dug it out. It was a small, white stone, worn perfectly round by the creek. She held it in her palm, its coolness a comfort against her skin. On impulse, she walked over to the wooden cross and placed the stone at its base. A small offering, an apology, perhaps, for living in a dead woman's house. When Elias came in that evening, he carried a heavy wool shawl. It was dark gray, thick and well-made. He walked over to where she sat on her pallet, mending a tear in her thin dress with thread she had unraveled from a discarded grain sack. He held the shawl out to her. "Nights are getting cold," he said. His voice was rough, as if the words were stones he had to dig out of his throat. She took the shawl. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of him, of wood smoke and clean earth. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the warmth sank deep into her bones, chasing away a chill she hadn't realized was there. It was the first gift she had received that was not a prelude to a demand. A week later, she began to hum. It was a tune she didn't know she remembered, a melody from a life before the dust. It was a small sound, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Elias was at the table, sharpening the blade of a hoe. He stopped, his hands going still. He didn't look at her, but he listened. He listened to the thin, wavering thread of music she spun into the quiet air of the cabin. When she trailed off, her courage failing, he resumed his work, the scrape of the whetstone against steel filling the silence she had made. Their communication was a language of objects. He left a pair of worn boots by her pallet one morning. They were too big, but she stuffed the toes with rags and they kept her feet from the sharp stones. She cooked a stew with vegetables from the garden and a rabbit he had snared. When he ate it, he looked at her and gave a single, slow nod. He had never complimented her cooking, but that night he ate a second bowl. It felt like a roar of applause. He was either the kindest man she had ever met, or the most foolish. She couldn't decide which. The nights grew longer, the wind turning mean as it scoured the plains. One evening, a storm blew in, a torrent of wind and rain that rattled the little cabin to its foundations. Thunder cracked overhead like the sky splitting apart. She sat on her pallet, the gray shawl pulled tight around her, trying not to tremble. A particularly violent clap of thunder, so close it shook the floorboards, tore a small cry from her throat. She pressed her hand to her mouth, ashamed of the sound. Across the room, Elias looked up from the harness he was mending. His face was cast in shadow and firelight. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She shook her head, unable to speak. Another blast of thunder, and she flinched, curling into a tighter ball. The storms reminded her of other nights, of loud voices and heavy hands, of being locked in a dark root cellar, the sounds of rage muffled by the earth above. "Don't lock me in," she whispered. The words escaped before she could stop them, thin and reedy. Elias put down the harness. He got up and walked not towards her, but towards the door. He took the heavy wooden bar that was used to secure it from the inside and laid it on the floor. Then he returned to his seat by the fire. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, leaving the door unlocked against the raging storm, a silent promise that she was not a prisoner here. She watched him, his profile stark against the flames. His presence was a bulwark against the chaos outside. He was not a savior. He was just a man who knew the value of an unlocked door. The storm passed. The silence that followed was different, cleaner, deeper. In that quiet, she found the courage to ask a question that had been sitting in her heart for weeks. "What was her name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias didn't pretend not to understand. He stared into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. "Sarah," he said. The name was rough, as if it hurt his mouth to say it. Her name was Sarah. She planted the flowers by the door, she stated, not a question. The marigolds, stubbornly blooming in the poor soil. He said. She said a house needed a bit of color to keep the gray out. They sat that way for a long time, sharing the memory of a woman she had never known. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The space between them, once a chasm of silence, was now bridged by a single name. She felt the first, tentative root of a new life take hold in the barren soil of her soul. It was a fragile thing, but it was a start. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He had a book, a thick, leather-bound ledger that he kept on a small shelf near the hearth. Some nights, after the work was done, he would sit at the table with it, a stub of a pencil in his calloused fingers, and he would labor. His brow would furrow in concentration, his lips moving silently as he counted. She would watch him from her palette, watch the struggle on his face. He was a man of the earth, of wood and steel and animal instinct. The world of numbers was a foreign country to him, and he was a clumsy tourist. One evening, he let out a sigh of pure frustration, pushing the book away from him. "Damn thing never balances," he muttered to the empty room. He got up and went outside to check on the horses, leaving the ledger open on the table. The page was a mess of his rough, blocky script. Columns of figures that didn't align, additions that seemed to wander off course. She hesitated. It was his private, but the frustration on his face had been a raw, unguarded thing. She rose from her pallet, the wool shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the table. She looked down at the page. It wasn't chaos to her. It was a language, a story of seed bought and grain sold, of profits and losses. A language her mother, a merchant's daughter, had taught her in another lifetime. A secret game between them with pebbles and charcoal marks on a slate. Before the dust, before the silence. She picked up the pencil stub. Her fingers, so used to the rough texture of thread and the smooth skin of vegetables, felt clumsy at first. Then the old knowledge flowed back. Her hand moved with a certainty that surprised her. She didn't erase his marks. She made new ones beside them, her script small and neat, a stark contrast to his. She found his error, a simple transposition of two numbers, a mistake of fatigue. With a few swift calculations, she made the columns align. The final sum at the bottom of the page was clean, perfect, and true. She put the pencil down and retreated to her palette just as the cabin door opened. Elias came back in, stamping the cold from his boots. He went to the table, ready to resume his struggle. He stopped. He stared at the page. He saw his own sprawling figures, and beside them the neat, precise corrections. He looked at the final, correct sum. He ran his finger under it, as if to test its reality. He slowly lifted his gaze and looked at her, where she sat pretending to be asleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. His face held a look she had never seen before. Not pity, not kindness, not even curiosity. It was a look of profound, staggering surprise, as if he had been living with a sparrow, only to watch it suddenly reveal the wings of an eagle. He said nothing. He simply closed the book, placed it back on the shelf, and banked the fire for the night. But something had shifted irrevocably. He had bought a stray. He was beginning to realize he had brought home a queen in hiding. The harbinger of the past arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a boy on a tired-looking mule. It was a letter. The boy, paid a nickel by a man in town, had been given directions to the reclusive Elias's homestead. He handed the folded, sealed paper to Elias and scurried away as if the silence of the place might swallow him whole. Elias stood in the yard, turning the paper over in his hands. It was addressed in a florid, self-important script he recognized immediately. Sterling. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and read. His face, already a mask of stoic reserve, seemed to harden into stone. She watched him from the doorway of the cabin, a dish rag clutched in her hand. She did not need to read the letter to know its contents. The past did not send friendly greetings. It came only to collect its debts. He finished reading, his jaw tight. He folded the paper with deliberate, angry precision and tucked it into his coat. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the homestead. The cabin, the mended fences, the small garden, the grave under the oak. He was a king surveying a kingdom under siege. His eyes finally met hers. They held a grim promise. "He's coming," Elias said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A storm warning. She nodded, her hand tightening on the rag. The old fear, the familiar ghost, rose up inside her, cold and cloying. The instinct was to run, to disappear, to become dust again. But then she looked at Elias, at the solid, unyielding set of his shoulders. She looked at the cabin, the first place she had felt the stirrings of safety. She looked at the white stone she had placed on Sarah's grave. Running meant abandoning this. It meant letting Sterling win. The day of the confrontation dawned clear and cold. A brittle autumn light fell across the plains. There was no hiding. The land was too open, too honest. Elias did not go to the fields. He spent the morning cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and methodical. It was not an act of aggression, but of preparation, like a farmer sharpening his scythe before the harvest. She made bread. She kneaded the dough with a fierce energy, pushing all her fear and rage into the pliable mass. The rhythmic thud of the dough on the floured tabletop was a drumbeat, a prayer, a declaration of war. The smell of baking bread filled the small cabin, a scent of home and defiance. They arrived just after midday, 3 riders cresting the low hill to the east. They were black silhouettes against the bright sky. Sterling was in the lead, sitting tall on a fine black horse. The 2 men with him were rougher, hired muscle who looked as if they were paid by the threat. Elias was waiting on the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms, pointed at the ground. He stood perfectly still, a part of the house itself. She stood just inside the open doorway, half hidden in the shadows. The warm, comforting scent of the bread was a strange contrast to the cold knot of dread in her stomach. Sterling and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, turning the yard into a battleground. Sterling's face was a mask of smug superiority. "Elias," he called out, his voice oozing false cordiality. "I've come to collect my property. The $5 was a loan, a deposit. You know that. I've come to settle the account." "There is no account to settle," Elias said, his voice flat and even. "The transaction was final." "A transaction you took advantage of," Sterling sneered, "taking a poor, simple-minded creature off my hands for a pittance. The town is talking. They say you're taking advantage of her." He leaned forward in his saddle. "I've come to rescue her from this squalor, to take her back to civilization." Elias's grip tightened on his rifle, his knuckles turning white. "She is not property, and she is not simple." Sterling laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Not simple? Elias, the woman is practically a mute animal. She has nothing between her ears but straw and dust." He turned his gaze to the doorway, finally spotting her in the shadows. His eyes slithered over her. "Come on out, girl. Your master is here to take you home." She froze. The word master struck her like a physical blow. It was the word that had defined her entire existence. It was the cage she had just begun to believe she could escape. "Leave her be." Elias's voice was a low growl. "Or what?" Sterling challenged, gesturing to his men. "You'll fight us all? An old, grieving farmer? For what? For her." He laughed again. "I heard you've even had her trying to do your books. That's a fine joke. Next you'll be asking her to explain the stars," he smirked. "Perhaps this simple thing can sort out my own ledgers." I'm sure her calculations would be as sound as her speech. And that was it. The moment, the word, calculations. Something inside her snapped. It was not a loud, violent break, but a quiet, decisive click, like a lock turning. She looked past Sterling's sneering face, past the hired thugs, and saw the long, bleak road of her life stretching out behind her. A road of dust and silence and being told what she was. No more. She stepped out of the shadows and into the stark sunlight. She was no longer hiding. She held the freshly baked loaf of bread in her hands. Elias glanced at her, a question in his eyes. She gave him a look, not of fear, but of fierce, blazing resolve. She walked past him, off the porch, and stopped directly in front of Sterling's horse. The animal shied nervously away from her sudden, silent appearance. "What is this?" Sterling demanded, frowning. "Offering me bread? I don't want your charity." She didn't speak. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, he saw not a vacant, simple girl, but a woman with a mind as sharp and cold as a winter morning. Her gaze dropped to the ledger Elias had left on the porch railing that morning. Then she looked back at Sterling. She remembered the numbers from the letter he had sent, the debt he claimed. It was an inflated, ridiculous figure. Using the hard crust of the bread as her slate and her fingernail as her chalk, she began to scratch numbers into its surface. A quick, complex series of calculations. The original debt Sterling had taken her for. The cost of her keep for 2 months, generously estimated. The $5 Elias had paid. Subtraction. Division. Her fingers moved with a blur of certainty. When she was done, she held the loaf up for him to see. Scratched into the crust was a single number. 3. The actual value of the debt in dollars. Pittance. An insult. Sterling stared at the loaf. He stared at the impossibly neat, impossibly quick calculation. His jaw went slack. The smug certainty drained from his face, replaced by a wave of disbelief, then confusion, then a dawning, sickening horror. He had built his entire argument on her being a simpleton, an object. And that object had just performed a piece of complex accounting on a loaf of bread and, in doing so, had utterly dismantled his pride and his lie. The 2 hired men stared, uncomprehending. They only knew that the situation had shifted in a way they didn't understand. "That loaf died in vain," Elias said. His voice laced with a dry irony that cut deeper than any threat. He stepped forward, standing beside her, no longer in front of her. They stood together, a unit. He looked Sterling in the eye. "She is not property. She has a name." He paused, then looked at her, his gaze full of a fierce, protective pride. He gave her the name he had decided on in the quiet hours of the night, the name that fit the woman he saw before him, not the girl who had arrived. "Her name is Lena." Lena. The name settled over her, not like a brand, but like the warm wool shawl. It was hers. She straightened her shoulders, claiming it. Sterling was speechless. He was a fool. He had been undone by a woman he called an animal, with a piece of bread. There was no recovery from this humiliation. To use force now would be to admit defeat, to attack a man and a woman on their own land for no reason other than his own wounded ego. The town would hear of this. His reputation, his polished veneer, was shattered. Section. He yanked on his horse's reins, his face a thunderous mask of fury and shame. "This isn't over," he spat, but the threat was hollow. It was over. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his hired men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. The dust of defeat. Lena and Elias stood in the yard, watching them go. The silence they left behind was vast and peaceful. The wind sighed through the oak tree. The sun warmed her face. He turned to her. He looked at the bread in her hands, at the numbers carved into its crust. Then he looked at her face, truly looked at her, and he smiled. It was a small, slow smile, one that seemed to crack the winter in his eyes, letting a little bit of spring through. "Lena," he said again, testing the name. Fit perfectly. She looked down at the bread, then back at him. "My mother taught me numbers," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. It was the first piece of her past she had ever offered. It was the first sentence of a new chapter. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. The silence was no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. The unspoken contract of survival had been fulfilled and was now replaced by something else, something fragile and unnamed. After their simple meal, Lena took the tattered, dust-colored dress she had arrived in, the dress that had been a uniform of her shame. She walked to the hearth and, without ceremony, pushed it into the glowing embers. It blackened, curled, and then caught flame, burning with a bright, clean light. She was not destroying her past. She was releasing it, turning it to ash. Elias watched her. When the last of the cloth was gone, he stood up and took his ledger from the shelf, the one she had corrected. He walked to the mantelpiece, cleared a space next to Sarah's small, carved box, and placed the book there. It was not a tool anymore. It was a trophy, a testament. He turned back to her. The firelight cast flickering shadows, but in his eyes, there was only a steady warmth. "I was scared," he admitted, the words costing him more than any sum of money. "I know," she said softly. "So was I. You didn't run. Neither did you." There was nothing more to say. He reached out, not to touch her face or her shoulder, but to gently take her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, a map of his life's labor. Her hand was small in his, but it did not tremble. They stood like that for a long moment, by the warmth of the fire, two solitudes merging into a shared strength. The house, once haunted by absence, breathed again. It was filled not with ghosts, but with the quiet, resilient promise of a future. The next day, he began to build a new room onto the cabin. A room for her. He did not ask. He simply began, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear autumn air, each one a note in a song of new beginnings. And as he worked, she sat on the porch, Sarah's shawl around her shoulders, his ledger open in her lap, bringing order to the numbers of their shared life. They were two broken pieces scarred by the world. But here, in the vast, quiet plains, under a sky that had seen everything, they had found that two broken pieces, when set together just right, could make a whole. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either had been alone. The final image was not of a dramatic kiss or a grand declaration. It was of two people on a porch at dusk. Him, leaning against a post, watching the colors fade from the sky. Her, sitting in a chair, her hands quiet in her lap. The space between them was not empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, of shared meals, of a battle won, of a name given and received. It was full of peace. The house behind them was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about recognition. It's about the moment one soul truly sees another, not for what the world has labeled them, but for the quiet, unshakable truth of who they are. Elias didn't save Lena by cutting a rope. He saved her when he saw her mind, her strength, her worth beyond the silence. And in doing so, he saved himself from the ghost-haunted silence of his own past. We all have our own ledgers, our own columns of profit and loss, joy and pain. And sometimes the world, in its carelessness, will try to tell you that your page is blank, that your sum is zero. It will call you simple. It will call you property. It will tie you to a post and try to sell you for a pittance. So here's your naming. You are not the label they give you. You are not the dust that clings to your clothes. Deep inside you, there is a language that only you know. A secret skill, a quiet strength, a calculation that can silence the proud and change the world, even if that world is just one small cabin on a lonely plain. Look for the ones who don't try to speak for you, but who simply make space for you to find your own voice. The ones who don't bar the door, but who stand with you when the storm comes. If you are brave enough to burn the rags of your old life, you might just find that what rises from the ash is not a ghost, but a queen. And her home is not a castle, but a place where she is, finally, truly seen.